Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a podcast and or video series about designing better miniature games. I am Mike Hutchinson. I designed a miniature game called Gaslands, another one called A Billion Suns, and some subsequent games that are also played with miniatures. This is Glenn. Glenn, what have you done?
I helped develop many of the games that Mike designed, and I've put out some non-miniatures games like SSO and Moonflight. But one of the things I do is have conversations with Mike on Rule of Carnage about designing better miniatures games.
Is that what we're going to do now?
I mean, we may as well, since the camera's running.
Excellent.
Mike, as you were introing, you were personifying in a beautiful and mime-like fashion. What is today's chat going to be about?
So I would like to discuss the ever-present spectre of bloat in miniature war games. So something that you and I have had to deal with pretty consistently on Gaslands. And every time we turn our hands to a new games design, the question of how much stuff to cram in to the game comes up. But I think it particularly comes up when you have a game and you want to make more of that game. And so you have to find ways to put more into the game or to provide more content for the game without doing something that people will then shout, "This is just bloat." In a way that they probably haven't defined exactly, which is what we will now do on this here podcast.
Yeah. So first off, there is a sort of what is bloat? Is it the same as power creep?
Is it the same as power creep?
I don't
think it is. No.
So for to define some terms,
power creep is just hotter and hotter curries, whereas bloat is just far too much.
So if you've got a game that constantly releases new content, and in order to sell the new content to you, each piece of new content is ever so slightly better than the previous piece of content, then you've got power creep, and you end up with a situation where the new thing is always the best thing, and it's very irritating, especially if you enjoyed playing the first thing and you've started playing the game because you enjoyed playing the first thing, and now you've got to buy the new thing because otherwise you're on the back foot.
Whereas, and of course, this doesn't just happen in miniature games. This happens across all kinds of commercial games, cardboard, video, all kinds.
Yeah, anything that, and I don't want to be too cynical, but
I'm not even sure that in most of the cases of power creep it's done with a cynical eye. I think people just get ever more excited, and because the tide keeps rising, in order to make the more exciting card or a more exciting unit, you have to do something even more cool and explodey. It can be a result of it over enthusiasm, I reckon.
I mean, yeah, there's a whole conversation. There's a conversation to be had about power creep, and we might have that conversation at some point. I think the thing about power creep is that, since we're talking about it, there's two problems. One is you've got a game that's been out there for X many years, and everybody has learned to play the things that are in that game, and then you've got to make a new thing that's competitive with the things that everyone learned to play, and they're all really good at playing the thing that's already out there.
So you've got to provide an instant win. Just add water.
The new thing has got to be really good. Otherwise, if you've got to learn it whilst the other person is just pantsing you with the thing that they've become expert at over the last 4 or 5 years, it's going to suck. So you've got a thing where you've got to build it so it just turns up and crushes people. And B, half the thing about learning a game is learning how the opposition's force works. And you've learned how to defend against a sword and an arrow and a hammer, and now I turn up with a combine harvester, and you're like, "Well, is this invincible?" It's like, no, you just haven't learned how to deal with it yet. So
the interesting thing about your description of power creep there, and what I think the place that you end up trying to avoid bloat, is that they end up with a kind of a similar solution, which is, I think, in a complex war game with a decent, healthy meta, as we discussed a few episodes ago, you're looking for, as you would describe it, like an interesting set of puzzles that as you unlock that puzzle box, new things become more powerful, and then the answers to why those aren't the most powerful become emergent, and so on and so on. And at some point, you just have to hit the big reset button. And that might be because you've power crept up to a place where you have to create something absolutely ludicrous, or only the last 2 or 3 things that you've put out are viable, or because you ended up wanting to expand the puzzle box, and so you put in all these extra drawers and little bits and bobs and new weapons and factions and skills and sub skills and all these other bits and bobs, to the point where it's just a massive sprawling mess of rubbish, and it's difficult to get into, and it's unapproachable, and also it's not that satisfying as a game design challenge, as a game like meta list building challenge. So they do end up with a similar potential solution. But I think that the thing with Bloat is, you're going to design a miniatures game, and it's going to provide the options that you think are cool, that you have had the time to design, had the time to play test, and feel you can stand behind as pretty robust, fun tools in the miniature game toolbox. But of course, like, you also had ideas for new kinds of swords, or different colors of dragons, or like whole other schools of driving skills, or whatever it is. And that's great, because that gives you all this space to release more content and have expansions and, and so forth. But I think that in order for it to qualify as Bloat, a couple of things probably have to be true. One is, I almost think that scenarios and campaigns can never be Bloat. We can come back to that one. But that things that are options that muddy the water of like every game, or options which nobody really asked for and nobody really wants, and now I have to sort of get past in order to get to my game. I think those things definitely qualify as Bloat. So an example of Bloat in Gaslands was, we released a bunch of new weapons and new vehicles in the time extended free PDFs in 2018, 2019. And I was excited to put more weapons out. The community wanted to see what other weapons were possible in Gaslands. And then when we re-looked at everything for Refueled, we decided that some of them were just not serving enough of a purpose. They hadn't found their niche, they were duplicating something, or they just weren't fun. And all of those things I would qualify as Bloat. They're just getting in the way. They're just cruft that needed to be cleared up. But the other meaning of Bloat, which I worry about quite a lot, and not to throw Car Wars under a bus, but it is like 35 years old now, so I think it's okay. Like, the first and second edition of Car Wars gets referred to sort of historically as having jumped the shark when it got to the point where there were like, boats and all these different kinds of like vehicle chassis that people didn't really want, and it was already a complicated build system to begin with. And then, like any RPG with lots of splat books, because it looked on paper more like an RPG in terms of its products line, like it just ended up with like just this insane array of potential options and potential things that you could buy, to the point where like nobody really wanted the boats, and probably some people did play the boats. But I also think that's a kind of Bloat where it's like, I've put these things in which are just because I thought of them, not because the game was better for having them.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, and I think you've answered one of the main questions here is, what people would say, what's wrong with Bloat? Isn't all extra content a good thing? You're getting more stuff. That has to be a good thing. I think the first answer to it, as you sort of suggested, is there, no. Right. The answer is by and large no.
Answer 0 is no. Yes.
The question is why. Why isn't more extra stuff always a good thing? And the first answer to it is it's extra mental overhead. If I build the game and it's got 6 good options that are interesting and work together in an interesting way, and then I say, okay, now here's 12 options, and okay, now there's 18 options, and okay, there's 24 options, and it's like, 6 options was okay. Learning 24 is starting to, become an issue. And also in most game situations, you're dealing with a very exponential situation where if you add
6 more options, then there are 6 people who can take that options and use them in different ways, and there are 36 ways that it can break, and then you add another 6 things, and now there are 36 times another 36 ways that it can break. And so it's just it also massively increases the surface area of potential problems.
And I think one of the situations where you see games that suffer from bloat is that they end up becoming like a homework assignment just to keep up with even a base level of competitiveness of the game, where you've got to sit at home, you've got to study textbooks of information and memorize everything and learn it all, and it can end up just feeling like a job. And I think
one of my favorite photos from on Twitter from the time of me being on the Malifaux tournament circuit was a good friend of mine who was a young man with an agile brain that was, empty of life and ready to be filled with Malifaux rules. He was a top tier player on the UK circuit, and there was a photo of him like in a hotel room the night before the grand final, like asleep in his Malifaux source book because he'd been studying before the big match. And that's kind of like it's fun, and it's what you have to do to be at that level. But that is like, that's where it starts to cross over into, as you say, into homework, which, to a degree, like there's a moment where that's good, and it's really, really hard to like surf that wave and delete content, which people don't do enough. Delete content at the same rate of adding it, whilst still keeping it foamy and interesting.
Yeah, and I have sort of previously we've had a little conversation about the term grognard capture, and I think there is one of these things where, as your core audience becomes more and more hardcore, they want more and more mental overhead pressure. It's a lovely way of gatekeeping new players for the hardcore grognardian players. So, well, now no new person can play our game because you have to memorize 57 books. This is perfect. I'll only ever play the same 4 people ever and ever and ever. And nobody else can get in.
Or it's just the fact that, like, as a nerd, like the deeper you get into something, the more you want of it. And the fact that you have to process this massive library of, whether it's alternative storylines in a comic book universe, or it's like the number of Arkham Horror cards that we now know about and can sort of cycle mentally through, like it's just a part of like the nerd brain sort of cataloging of the world, and doing that thing. So there is some satisfaction and purpose in it, but it's at a huge cost, as you say, to the potential approachability. So I think that's for me is it's bloat sort of creates this barrier to understanding what's going on in the game, and then it also, I think, creates a real risk of disappointment insofar as you can bring people what they think they want, which is more stuff. And then when they put the stuff on the table, they go, oh, actually, that wasn't as exciting as I was expecting. That was just some more stuff, which is one of the reasons that both you and I are really suspicious when we ask people what they want and they ask for more stuff, because we suspect that actually they don't want more stuff. And if they had more stuff, they'd be they'd have a slightly cold and empty feeling of ennui.
Yeah, I think if you think of adding an option, consider whether it and the rules I come up with are distract, dilute, or duplicate from what's already in the game. Mm-hmm. So if your game is doing one thing, and the thing you can add in there is just going to distract people from the cool things that are in your game, that it's just going to add some extra drag onto it, maybe drop it off. If you're going to dilute the options already in the game, one of the things that people love about the factions and forces in the games they enjoy is that they're unique. I can raise extra minions, but I have loads of long range shooting. Well, there's this new expansion that means that now I have long range shooting and can raise miniatures. Oh, that's fine, because now I, with my long range shooting, can also raise extra miniatures. So, so we can all do everything. Why am I playing this particular force or faction? There's no reason. They wear a different hat from the other faction. That's why you're playing.
Poor end time legions in Warhammer.
Yeah, so it's like if you're adding something in that makes all of your previous forces be able to do something they couldn't do before, and then just diluting all of your content into a sort of brown grey goo of similarity, that's not going to benefit anybody. And is the additional stuff going to end up duplicating something that already exists? There's if you play Magic the Gathering, you'll be, for example, well aware that there are literally hundreds of cards that do exactly the same thing. I mean, some of them do exactly the same thing incrementally better for exactly the same cost. And then you've got people sitting down going, okay, let's build a tier list of our 2-point red damage, and unless you've got a very specific audience and a very specific set of people, you're just creating options that nobody wants, either tactically or thematically. And ultimately, if you're adding work for yourself and you're adding work for your audience, and all you're doing is putting in things that make the game in one way or another worse, I think that's one of the definitions of bloat. It's just padding that gets in the way, slows everybody down, and doesn't.
Yeah, it's interesting because there is a sort of neutrality in bloats that as I think about it, which is like you could say something that's inert or something that's just bad. Like if you add a new unit or you add a new weapon that no one wants because it's rubbish, then that is clearly bloat. Like that's just a useless withered appendage. There's no appendix. There's no need for it to exist. No one wants it. No one's going to use it. But there can be things that are perfectly decent and people will take. But maybe they just take them 50% of the time because they're basically the same as the other thing. Like it's a slightly different heavy machine gun. Like they're both fine, but I don't need both of them, and I'm confused about why they both exist.
So I think, obviously, one of the main areas we can definitely talk about in relation to this is Gaslands. There's been extra content put out there now. Right when Gaslands first came out, I had a list of potential additional sponsors, and as we went through Time Extended and into Refueled, there were points when I said we can easily knock out another 3 sponsors, probably another 6, and you said to me, no, we're not going to do that. You're not allowed to do that. That's going to create bloat in Gaslands. I'm not going to. And but they're going to be so cool. This one's going to be really cool. It's like I don't care how cool it is. I don't care how well it works or how neatly it fits in with the existing teams or the rules. It's going to be bloat. And there was a point where you just put your foot down and just said, that's it, no more sponsors, stop testing and
stop suggesting sponsors,
just stop it. That's all there is to it. There's not going to be any more. And obviously I think, but none of them were bad sponsors, none of them didn't work. There was a whole because there's the horror perks in Gaslands. There was literally a whole set of horror options. We could have done a whole Halloween spin-off quite happily with the sponsors that were available there. And you were just like, no, it's irrespective of how good they are or how well they work, it's just going to bloat the game. You wanted people to be turning up, knowing all the teams that were in there, knowing what they were going to meet, and always be able to go, well, everything that's on the table is chewy meaty goodness. I'm aware of it. I'm not going to get gotcha'd by something bizarre turning up, and I don't have to sit down and study at the degree level of Gaslands in order to comprehend the game. Other than that just being me saying a bunch of stuff, why is it just that you were like, no, I just don't want it to bloat? Is it, I suppose quite a good question here is, in your opinion, when should something be an expansion, an add-on like Time Extended, and when should something be a new edition like Refueled? Where is that line of saying, okay, it's time to cut it off and move on from it, and when is it like, yeah, no, one more's probably fine?
I don't know. I mean, I don't have enough experience of getting this right and getting this wrong to know for sure. What I have is experience of systems where I feel like other game systems that I have played where I feel that they have been in a Goldilocks zone, and then they have crossed over into this is a bunch like I have been on the journey as you have with X-Wing, the miniatures game, when it didn't have enough ships, and then it was absolutely golden, and then it just had a bunch of garbage, and I didn't know what all of this rubbish was. And lots of systems have gone through that same bell curve. And so I think, like, editorially, I wanted to establish, like, 6 sponsors felt like a really nice place to start, that established the playing area, it pulled the design space open, it gave everyone this feeling of like, oh, what you do is you have a sponsor and it does this sort of thing. But 6 was never enough. Like, six was a plotting out of the design space, but it wasn't a filling in of it. And so the question then was, is it 9? Is it 12? Is it 18? Like, what's the right number?
47.
and ultimately it came down to a personal taste of like, how many of these things do I feel as a player I can kind of keep in my head. And I find that there are 12, I think, in Refueled, and I think 12 is just at the outside point of you being able to remember what's going on. There's a brain heuristic of you can remember 7 things plus or minus 2. And so, 9 would be much like 6. 9 would be super comfortable and everyone would be like, yeah, I remember all the sponsors, I remember all their rules. And so 12 is a good spot that's just north of that, where it's like, I feel just on the edge of having mastery of this system and I have to play it a bit in order to kind of really understand them. So it's just trying to find a intuitive Goldilocks zone between it's hard enough to master, it's easy enough to get into, you don't just forget half the things, and there isn't just like a factorial explosion of possible ways of using everything. I suppose I think at this point, Gaslands could definitely stand another 6 sponsors for those people that have completely absorbed all of those ones. But for those people who haven't really played all of the sponsors, of which there are loads, and who are only just now discovering that Beverly exists at the back of the list, like, they don't need another 6. They're busily figuring out where all the scenario, like, they haven't yet all played all the scenarios and played all the teams, and it's tricky.
This is the thing. It's a difficult question as to who your audience is and where you're pitching parts of your game for, because like you say, there have been people who've been playing Gaslands for years now, and 12 is a heavy number when you first pick the book up, but
you quickly play through it.
Yeah, that's achievable after 2, 3, 4 years of playing the game. And the thing is about another supplement, another add-on, is if you're pitching it as somebody who's been playing the game for 5 years, another 6 sponsors is absolutely no issue. If it's the sort of thing where a new player is going to go, right, well, I want all of the stuff. Do I need this? Do I need that?
People will go, well, it's more and it's good, and you probably want it. You'll want it at some point, right? I'll buy it.
Yeah, and then you're just creating sort of a gatekeeping overhead for new players. And I think it's interesting. And no offense by this, but in relation to like whether when a system bloats or not is possibly down to the personality of whoever's sort of at the core of controlling it. But your willingness and capacity to hold mentally multiple different forces. And for example, if again, I've said it many times, if Gaslands were my game, it'd be a different game. And one of the places it'd be a different game is that I've got 14 Warhammer armies and I have them all in my head perfectly happily, and even now, sort of a decade after possibly the last time I played with them, 24 sponsors I think is probably a decent opening level for most people, presumably. I would so I suppose a certain amount of this is figuring out the person that you're pitching to, and figuring out the person that you're pitching from. Know thyself.
Well, I have a very, very clear rule here, which is create the things that you would want to consume. And like, in no way is it an insult to say, I'm the kind of person who can only remember 7 things, and you're the sort of person who can remember 24. I think that just underscores, like, one, when you're designing games, there's a really strong editorial voice that needs to come through. Like, it is authorial, but it's mostly editorial, which is like, what am I going to cut? What am I going to include? And that it is also authorial. Like, it's the thing that you would want. Like, why are you creating a game? It's because it's the thing that you want. That thing that you want doesn't exist, so I'm just going to go ahead and write this thing that I want. And so I wouldn't have wanted that thing with 24 opening sponsors in the blue book, because I wouldn't have known what to do with it. And so I guess it got to the point where I started to feel with Refueled, where it's like, no, this is going beyond the place that I would feel excited and comfortable to explain to somebody else in an enthusiastic way. Hey, there's this game, I made it, it's everything that I love about pushing toy cars around, except it has this really, really dense and complicated, like, Scrabble puzzle at the heart of it, which frankly even I don't understand.
The guy over there, he'll explain.
You see these pages? These are for you and me. You see these pages? I don't look at these pages. I don't know who they're for, but it's not for you and me, Sunshine. Not for the likes of you.
Yes, they're for a strange and pale breed of person who's going to sit under the desk and muttering and making notes. And
but we probably should talk about this more often than we do. Like, the reason that I enjoy working with you is that because you enjoy games in a different way, or you take some different focuses on games, it's pushed me into places that are uncomfortable, and that has made, allowed me to grow different game design muscles. And I hope that the reverse is true as well. So, like, the act of collaboration is not one of I get final authorial editorial decision making, and therefore there will be 6 sponsors, and any more than 6 is bloat, because honestly, Sunshine, I can't be asked to learn more than 6.
Yeah. I mean, again, we've alluded to it once before, but we definitely have to have a conversation about the nature of collaboration and developer and designer and such like. But in relation to today's conversation, I think one of the things I wanted to ask is, so there was a point where with time extended was optional. It was a thing where you ask your opponent's permission before using this thing, blah blah blah.
It never said that, though. It never said that. That was one of those things, like, Gaslands is not WYSIWYG, that just, like, the universe has decided that. Mike didn't say that.
Sure, but the time extended certainly wasn't an official expansion, and it was made by the Gaslands designer, and it was designed by Osprey, laid out by Osprey. In what way wasn't it official? If you were turning up to a pickup game with stuff from Time Extended, and the other person went, "What the hell is that? I haven't heard about that. It looks overpowered. I don't want you to use it."
So when you see an optional army list in White Dwarf for Warhammer, what do you think about that? Is that the same?
Yeah, I would assume that I have to say to the other person, "Hey, I'm using this army list from Warhammer. Are you okay with this?"
See, because I think that potentially interacts differently with the question of bloat, or rather, it's a different socket.
Yeah, well, I'm going somewhere with the question here, and that is, I think that, for example, Time Extended. I think Time Extended is a sort of. I know it's as official as any part of Gaslands, but it's. If you were doing if Gasland tournaments were a big thing, Time Extended would possibly not have been permitted in Gaslands tournaments. Versus Refueled, and Refueled is like Gaslands canon. And I suppose the question here is, if you say, okay, this is not the canon version. Time Extended was for slightly more hardcore fans, people who were digging in, looking things up, downloading stuff, following on Facebook or whatever else. Yeah. It wasn't for the more casual player, the person who just picked it up at the store, went home with some Hot Wheels and played with their 4 friends.
That's right.
Does, and the root of the question here is, does saying, okay, this is not the canon part of the game, does that absolve bloat? Is that a get out clause for just letting the game run riot. And
I think it's really risky to do that, because you don't know how the community will react to that content. So although, yes, I mean, like it could be that people pick that stuff up and go, oh, okay, this is just more of the same, and I just, I print out the new table of weapons, and now that's just what we use as a group. Or they might all decide that it's some special, White Dwarf only thing, and you have to get permission. But I don't think that you necessarily get to decide that as the designer or the community manager. I think the community will probably just figure that out for itself and make a decision. There's probably ways of controlling that I have been unsuccessful to do. So, because if it is considered to be a sort of funky Halloween adjunct, then yes, I think it does absolve it as bloat. It's like, it's an optional scenario, it's an optional kind of extra that I can plug in and take away, and doesn't really affect the core balance of the game. But if it gets, I'm trying to think of a good example here from another game. Like if you take Malifaux, for example, like each new expansion book that comes out for Malifaux introduces a whole set of models which you are expected to examine and then find places to plug into your existing crews and your existing play styles. And so if those had been offered as, well, here's some new models and you can use them or don't use them, but they've not really got anything to do with the core game, then maybe that would have absolved them from bloat. Or if everybody had decided that, like, maybe the tournament scene had grown up and just been like, well, we're only going to go with the core masters. I think it's also that a miniature skirmish game, particularly the kind of relatively tightly scoped games that you and I end up working on, like, they have a lot less surface area to accept bloat. So in a very modular system, to a degree like Malifaux, but much more like army games like Warhammer, or even stuff like Infinity, like where there's lots of breadth of places to slot stuff in, I think you end up hitting the bloat point slower, because things are like that, they're collected into little clumps in a way that sort of limits the blast radius of that additional content. Whereas in Gaslands, and perhaps this is a place to really explore and push, like when you added a new rocket launcher, like boom, everybody got the new rocket launcher. And we created a perk system where we didn't end up like adding a 7th or an 8th perk to each system, to each set, which would have limited the blast radius but increased the complexity of running that sponsor. So I don't know. I think it depends on it. It depends on the blast radius, I think, about whether or not you get absolved from it being bloat or not.
So last sort of question. Personally, I find that when I write out a set of options for a team, like when I've been designing, developing the teams in Gaslands, I know the team I would be taking. I think there's a sort of a form of sort of evolution where it's like, well, there's only one list that's going to be the best list, and I'm in my head knowing what for me is the best list, and that's what I'm going to take. But if I would write literally just the options I'm going to take, that's nowhere near enough stuff for most people. So I've got to write stuff that that I know I would never take. And usually it's with this sort of thought in my head of, well, this is funny, this is hilarious, or this is a thing that could be interesting if you wanted to play a certain way, but I probably wouldn't play that way. But given that inherently my inclination is to put in more stuff and give people more options and play with emergent properties and things like that, and I'm always putting in stuff that I would probably never put in a team that I was using anyway, but because that should be in there. It should have an option to set people on fire. It should have an option to blow people up. It should have a this or that or the other, whether or not I'm going to use them. How do you, when you think that it's occurring, how do you know when bloat is occurring? Because I find I can't just go on my sort of version of, is this as much as I need to play the game? Because no, I need like a third of any system to play the game, because I'm chucking out 2/3 options. In every game I've ever played, I've chucked out 2/3 of the options immediately. I think most people do. It'd be weird if you had every single option for every single army, that you've ever played. So how do you tell, or how do you think you tell when bloat is happening, and when are you just offering options that you personally would be taking anyway?
Oddly, I think that might be one of my strengths, because I'm not a super analytical list builder. I tend to take a slightly holistic view of those things, and I'm looking for want of a better word, like mouthfeel for like the list. Like, does this feel like it's got the right creaminess and crunchiness, and does it look about the right weight? And I'm very, very rarely calculating which of these options I will take versus anybody else. I'm trying to see, like, holistically, does this feel like there's anything obviously missing where people will be disappointed that Molotov cocktails don't exist, even though I might not have played them that often, or simple things like there is a structure that's established, which is every perk class has 6 perks, and every sponsor has 2 perk classes. Like, those are both completely arbitrary rules. It would be totally reasonable to have totally variable lists of numbers of perks, and perhaps some sponsors only have 1 or to have 3. Like, it doesn't really matter. The question is, like, aesthetically and mouthfeel wise, like, does it just come across as a pleasing design? And I guess it is just like, it's a very pure word use of that word. It's just, you're just designing for satisfaction, for approachability, for like pattern matching, for triggering enough of the imagination without like overloading the senses. Like, I don't know, it's just aesthetics. And I know that's an unsatisfactory answer, but I suppose it's paradoxically one of the things that I feel like I'm probably stronger at, because I'm less analytical in list building.
I suppose, so to wrap up on this, the thing is, be aware that not all extra content is inherently a good thing. Be aware that just sticking in more stuff isn't always good. Learn to edit, learn to sort of thin things down. Try and find the lean core of your game. And if you're lucky enough to be in the position to be able to put out expansions, put out second editions, put out extras, try and do it with a bit of discipline. Unless you're obviously there are certain games that could just keep putting out stuff and it will keep selling and keep working. Probably you're not going to be in a position to have that sort of support. Consider saying, okay, this is where we need to sort of put a full stop on that. Maybe it's time for a whole other cycle of the game, a whole other world, a whole other era in which we can put in all the stuff we wanted, but it doesn't have to relate to the other bits and pieces. So unless you've got anything, are there particular words of wisdom to add to that one?
Nope.
We will wrap up on this conversation from Rule of Carnage. If you've watched this far into this conversation, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you like some part of what we do here. If you do, please like and subscribe. If not, or if you just want to open a conversation about games that you think maybe have reached a point of bloat, if you've got insights into exactly where the dividing line of when a game went over that Goldilocks line from lots of interesting content to bloat, please drop a comment in the comment section, start a conversation on it. There's plenty to be said about it.
Also, has any game ever come back from being bloated without just having a big reset edition? I can't think of one, but maybe you can.
I mean, yeah, no, nothing's immediately occurring. But yeah, if anybody thinks there is a game that definitively hit a point of bloat, didn't reset, but managed to do something to claw it back in, level things back out again, please, we'd love to hear those sorts of opinions and those points of view. But for now, look us up on Twitter, hit us up on social media. But we're going to say goodbye from this edition of Rule of Carnage. So bye bye bye.